odd holiday this is, huh? We so rarely, we Lutherans and we Protestants, even other Protestants even more than us, so rarely use saint language. So I want to start by inviting you to think about and maybe share with the rest of us what saint means to you, how you grew up thinking about saints, and if it's changed, if you ever refer to somebody as a saint, what do you mean by that? So who wants to talk saint stuff? Well, I can start, because I grew up Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, and we were taught that every Christian was a saint, and we were taught that Catholics were really screwed up in thinking that saints were special and different, because the saints were all of us, and they were really screwed up in thinking that saints were somehow intermediary figures, because, we're God's beloved children, and we don't need no stinking intermediaries. So, and I find that now, in my everyday life, I hardly ever say saint. I hardly ever use it, except this particular time of year, when it comes up on the church calendar, and I go, and I say, theoretically, I still believe that every Christian is a saint, but it just isn't part of my everyday language. Anybody else have a saint history? Yeah.
I grew up at ELCA. So we didn't talk about saints very much, except for on this day. And then I don't really remember it being a big day. But my family, we talk about my grandparents. And my grandfather was kind of the godfather of the church. He did everything. He was on everything. But it wasn't because of that. It was just because he represented kind of what we all aspire to be. So when I think of saints, it's who I aspire to be. My grandparents, my family, friends of the family, anybody who knew my grandparents would say, they're saints.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give the Catholic perspective.
Thank you. I was hoping somebody would.
We'll reinforce it.
No, I value very much of my upbringing in the Catholic Church, and I think you had to earn it, be canonized. Your whole life had to reflect being worthy of being canonized to be a saint. But I still pray to St. Anthony when I'm missing something. I wear my St. Christopher medal. I value the saints I was brought up very much still, but my definition definitely has grown.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to know who the saint of IT is. There's so many, my iPhone and everything, so yeah, I get
That
it.
seemed, maybe seemed
But yet-
impossible.
Yesterday at Walgreens, the pharmacist was being very kind to a lady who was very confused about her prescription, and she was taking a lot of time, and then we were waiting for a booster shot, and so when he walked in, I said, "You have the patience of a saint." So it's somebody that goes over and above and has patience, I guess.
Thank you.
I think growing up, that's the definition that we give mostly to people who go over and above. Oh my God, you're a saint. But I do pray for lost things.
Me too.
I pray to that saint. But in writing this service, I wrote the definition of what a saint is. But in Lutheran theology, we all know that we are both saints and sinners. So, I said, okay, you make me a saint, but you're also really bad saint.
Yeah, right.
I think one of the differences between the Catholic ideas and the Protestant idea is that in the Catholic faith, you need to be a saint your entire life to become a saint. In our way of looking at things, you can be a saint for a minute.
Thank God.
Or you could be a saint who's only saintly for a minute. Carol?
What I've come to believe is that we're all saints, and that is not limited to Christians. I'm not really interested in Christianity if we continue to be that exclusionary. But I do also believe that whatever it is God is calling us to, we are called to live in to our sainthood. And it may just be by little drops of oil along the way, as you said. Sometimes that's the best any of us get done.
Thank you.
Well, when the intellect finally kicked in, I thought, well, but aren't we all saints and sinners at exactly the same time? But then, before that, the emotion kicked in, and I immediately thought of Lady Sturgis in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who, when I had lost my father and my job in the first week of 1983, and I was working in a meatpacking plant, had never done any of that kind of work before, and so I was very upset because of things that had suddenly changed in my life. And they were very patient with me, but I was so slow because I was learning. And they said, I'm going to teach you how to run the packing machine, how to make the boxes. And he worked with me, and my speed picked up, and he said, after a while, he said, you know, you're doing the job. And I went, oh my God, I am. And that was my first words, saint today.
You're sainthood.
Bob?
I think our exclusionariness is often looking at other spiritual communities. In the Buddhist community, I think they talk about bodhisattva, which is, it has a lot of meanings, but one of the meanings is you are prepared to go into nirvana, but you stay back until everyone goes. And you think of Martin Luther King saying, I'm not free until everybody's free. We keep hearing that, the women's movement and many movements, but I think that we also, in Islam, I think, when you read the Quran everywhere, is that God blesses us. And I think that's another way of talking about it.
Yeah, I think as Lutherans, we are not as absolutely dedicated to theological consistency as some people are. And so we sometimes are a little bit contradictory in the way that we talk about stuff, and that includes saints. I mean, sometimes we do talk about saints as if they are people who live particularly sanctified lives. I mean, like as Carol was saying, we don't need to think only about Christians, because how many people would think that Gandhi wasn't a saint? On the other hand, we don't have to think about the Gandhi-ness of someone to recognize them as saint. I mean, any time, if every person is created in the image of God, that's a sanctification in itself. That's a sanctifying in itself. And anytime you notice somebody living out the image of God in their lives, then I think that's saint stuff. So anyway, in popular culture, a saint is a person who's really good, and I think that's how we usually hear people using saint language, that above and beyond stuff that we were talking about before, especially a person who does good things for other people, who lives a kind of selflessness. But we still have inherited the religious arguments of the Reformation era, where the church, before it split up, had developed a particular theology around sainthood, in which only some Christians were named saints, while most of us were not. And yes, it had to do with the goodness of your life and the unshakability of your faith, and of course, being a martyr was kind of a shortcut. And it had to do with being associated with miracles. And there developed this kind of piety around the saints because there was this idea that they were somehow closer to God And because they were somehow closer to God, they were good to have as spiritual contacts. You know, you could ask a saint to put in a good word for you with the big boss. And that was exactly what was not cool with the reformers. You don't need an intermediary. You were God's child. You could approach the holy as naturally as a child approaches parents. And a lot of the teaching about saints, I think, in Protestant churches, a lot of the historical teaching about saints was lost as a byproduct of justification by faith. And then the reformers noticed that the language of saints in the Bible was different from the language of saints in the church. Especially in Paul's letters, there are greetings to all the saints, meaning the whole congregation. You didn't have to be particularly holy, and you sure didn't have to be dead, biblically speaking. And we Lutherans, we are still a bit skitsy about it. We remind one another, and it's often on the first Sunday in November, that all Christians are saints, not just dead ones. Certainly not just dead ones who were particularly pious during their lifetimes and have been credited with miracles. On the other hand, we hardly ever use the title. When we use it with a person's name, it's usually a biblical character, and it's often in a church name, St. Mark, St. John's. Sometimes we'll use it for a historical figure, like St. Francis. That's one I think I hear most often. But when we honor people, especially the memory of people who did good things, who worked for positive change, we sometimes use saint language for it. But I think it often feels as though it's a bit forced, as if we're stepping outside of our native language. It's not part of our everyday discourse and doesn't come all that naturally to us as Protestants. Our readings today gave us different ways of thinking about saints, and I love that, the difference among them. The first reading from Revelation gives this vision of the white-robed multitude, those who came through a great ordeal, whose existence now consists of praise. So there you get the idea of that links up saints and martyrdom, that these are people who suffered greatly for the faith, and here they are now in living a blessed eternity of nothing but praise and white robes. The psalm, it calls out to all the people in the worshiping community. Fear the Lord, you his holy ones, you his saints, which is to say the whole community consists of God's saints. And that's the image that continues in the second reading. We are God's children now. And in the fullness of Revelation, we will all become like God. The gospel reading is concerned not with naming people saints, but with describing what it means to live a blessed life. You might say a saintly life, a sanctified life. This is what is good. A life that is poor in spirit. A life that acknowledges grief. A life that doesn't advance one's own claims, that has turned its desire to what is right, that exercises compassion, that is single-hearted, that works for peace. This describes a life well lived, a life that does not deny itself but doesn't orient either to its own desires, a life that looks to others with compassion and longs for peace. This is the kind of life I think our world is crying out for these days. Crying out for always, but maybe especially these days. And this is a kind of life I can think of as saintly, but then I want to be careful about not saying, but you give up all that saint stuff as soon as you screw up, because, we do. We can still call ourselves and each other saints when we're not living up to it. On this Sunday, when we tend to think about the church historically, we can include its recent history. So when we celebrate all the saints, we remember our ancestors in the faith, those personally meaningful to any of us, as well as those who are culturally meaningful. And we acknowledge that their history is not only all around us, but also in us. And often enough, Sunday to Sunday, what leads into the Holy Holy during our communion service is a reminder that we are in the company of all God's people, of all times and places, all the saints. At that table, chronological time drops away. It is as if our dead parents and grandparents are here too, as if children and great-grandchildren yet to be born, they are here too. It's as though the historical figures we most admire, including those that we see listed on our great cloud of witnesses, those who will come up in the communion thanksgiving, those we will name when we're invited to, all of them are at the table with us. For that, as if, for that togetherness we begin to experience, we give thanks. And then that thanks spreads outward from this space into the lives we live as God's flawed saints in this world. Not God's people, but God's people who sometimes have the grace to reach out, sometimes imperfectly, and sometimes beyond our ability. In the name of the one who has the compassion, the grace, to name each one of us saints in spite of ourselves. Amen.